The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that clung to the spectators like a second skin. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the otherwise stagnant air. Every cough, every rustle of paper, echoed in the hushed expectancy. Judge Richard Calloway, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with a hint of amusement, surveyed the scene with a detached air. He'd seen it all before: the desperate pleas, the theatrical displays of innocence, the inevitable crumbling under the weight of evidence. This case, he thought, glancing at the disheveled figure of Jonathan Ellis standing alone at the defendant's table, would be no different. Mr. Ellis, Judge Calloway's voice, though not unkind, carried a note of weary condescension. I assume you understand the risks of representing yourself in this matter? The state has presented a rather compelling case against you. He adjusted his spectacles, a glint of impatience in his eyes. He'd hoped for a quick resolution, not a protracted spectacle of amateur legal maneuvering. Jonathan Ellis, his tie askew and his suit rumpled, felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom. Each pair of eyes seemed to hold a judgment, a silent condemnation. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat a stark contrast to the cold sweat slicking his palms. Compelling? He thought, a flicker of anger igniting beneath his carefully constructed composure. Compellingly fabricated. Assistant District Attorney Adam Grayson, a picture of smug satisfaction, sat at the prosecution table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Grayson had meticulously woven a narrative of greed and betrayal, painting Jonathan as a cunning embezzler who had systematically drained the coffers of his own firm. The evidence, on the surface, was damning. Suspicious transactions, altered records, missing funds. The jury, a collection of impassive faces, seemed already convinced of his guilt. Jonathan took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing himself to maintain the calm facade he'd painstakingly constructed. He knew the truth, and that, he realized, was his only weapon. Your Honor, he began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor of adrenaline coursing through him. I know the truth. The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge in the face of overwhelming odds. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow, a spark of something akin to curiosity flickering in his eyes. The amusement was gone, replaced by a nascent interest. Proceed, Mr. Ellis, the judge said, his tone now devoid of its earlier condescension. The shift, subtle yet perceptible, was not lost on Grayson. His smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his features. Jonathan began his defense, his voice calm and measured. He knew he couldn't match Grayson's theatrical flair, his practiced pronouncements of legalese. His strategy was different. He spoke plainly, directly, focusing on the inconsistencies, the gaps in the prosecution's narrative. He presented emails, meticulously documented transactions, and internal memos that had conveniently been omitted from Grayson's presentation. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the prosecution's case, like a sculptor patiently revealing the form hidden within the stone. With every document, every carefully chosen word, Jonathan felt the tide beginning to turn. The judge, initially dismissive, leaned forward in his chair, his gaze fixed on Jonathan, his expression unreadable. The jury, once impassive, began to exchange glances, a murmur of uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Grayson, his initial confidence replaced by a growing unease, objected repeatedly, his voice rising in pitch with each overruled objection. He sensed the ground shifting beneath him, the carefully constructed narrative unraveling thread by thread. He couldn't have Grayson thought, a cold dread creeping into his heart. I checked everything. He glanced at Franklin Dorsey, Jonathan's former boss, seated in the gallery. Dorsey's face was a mask of stone, his eyes betraying nothing. But the rigid set of his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands, spoke volumes. Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength as he laid bare the truth. He exposed Dorsey's elaborate scheme, meticulously detailing how he had manipulated the accounts, forged documents, and used Jonathan as a scapegoat. He presented evidence of Dorsey's lavish spending, his unexplained wealth, all carefully concealed beneath a veneer of corporate respectability. The courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers and Jonathan's clear, unwavering voice. The tension was almost unbearable, a taut string stretched to the breaking point. He then introduced another player into the narrative, Mark Singleton, a junior analyst who had worked closely with both Jonathan and Dorsey. Jonathan presented emails, internal communications, and financial records that implicated Singleton as Dorsey's accomplice. He detailed how Singleton had facilitated the transactions, altered the records, and helped Dorsey cover his tracks. Singleton, seated in the gallery behind Dorsey, paled visibly, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. Judge Calloway, his initial amusement long gone, listened intently, his face etched with a growing understanding. He had seen enough cases to recognize the ring of truth in Jonathan's words, the undeniable weight of his evidence. The jury, now fully engaged, hung on every word, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Grayson, realizing the futility of his position, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the prosecution's case. He questioned Jonathan's motives, insinuated a personal vendetta against Dorsey, but his arguments lacked conviction, his voice hollow. Jonathan countered with calm logic, dismantling Grayson's claims point by point. The final blow came when, under the pressure of mounting evidence and Jonathan's relentless questioning, Singleton broke down and confessed, his voice barely a whisper, admitting to his role in Dorsey's scheme and implicating Dorsey directly. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the courtroom, once thick with anticipation, now crackled with the raw energy of revelation. Judge Calloway, his face grave, looked at Jonathan, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds you not guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him in a wave so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. Against all odds, he had exposed the truth. As the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of whispers and murmurs, Jonathan met Dorsey's gaze across the room. Dorsey's face, once impassive, was now contorted in a mask of rage and defeat. The subtle shift in power, the silent acknowledgement of defeat in those eyes, was more satisfying than any verdict. Justice, Jonathan realized, had finally been served. The sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows seemed brighter now, the air lighter, cleansed of the suffocating tension that had held it captive for so long. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a monotonous drone that seemed to amplify the tension thickening the air. Jonathan Ellis sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze fixed on the witness stand. Outwardly, he was a study in composure, a stillness in the heart of a brewing storm. But beneath the placid surface, a tempest raged. He watched Dorsey, his former boss, swear an oath on a Bible that felt miles away from the man's corrupted soul. Each word Dorsey spoke felt like a shard of glass twisting in Jonathan's gut. He's lying. He's so good at it. The thought was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had trusted this man, respected him, even. Now, watching the practiced sincerity on Dorsey's face, Jonathan felt a cold wave of nausea. Patience, he told himself, clenching his jaw. It's almost time. Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, paced before the witness stand, his voice a practiced blend of authority and concern. He painted a picture of Jonathan as a promising young consultant, intelligent, driven, but ultimately seduced by greed. Jonathan listened, detached, almost as if Grayson were describing a stranger. He could almost admire the performance, the way Grayson wove his narrative, tightening the noose of circumstantial evidence around an invisible neck. He believes his own story, Jonathan mused, a flicker of something akin to pity stirring within him. He's been played just as thoroughly as I was. Mr. Dorsey, Grayson's voice boomed through the courtroom, echoing faintly off the high ceiling. "Would you please describe Mr. Ellis's responsibilities within your firm?" Dorsey's voice was smooth, confident. He spoke of Jonathan's access to company accounts, his proficiency with financial software, the implicit trust placed in him. Jonathan watched the jury, their faces rapt, absorbing every word. He could see the seeds of doubt planted by Grayson taking root, blossoming into suspicion. "They're buying it." He realized, the coldness in his stomach intensifying. "They're looking at me and seeing a criminal." Grayson's questions grew sharper, more pointed. He guided Dorsey through a meticulous recounting of the missing funds, the discrepancies in the accounts, all subtly pointing the finger at Jonathan. Dorsey played his part perfectly, his voice laced with a carefully crafted blend of regret and righteous indignation. Jonathan could feel the weight of the courtroom's judgment pressing down on him, suffocating him. He fought the urge to react, to interrupt, to defend himself. Not yet, he reminded himself, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. Wait for the right moment. "And finally, Mr. Dorsey," Grayson announced, his voice ringing with triumph, "what, in your professional opinion, led to this unfortunate incident?" Dorsey paused, a dramatic sigh escaping his lips. All trails led back to Jonathan Ellis. The words hung in the air, heavy, accusatory, sealing Jonathan's fate in the eyes of everyone present. Judge Calloway leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The jury exchanged knowing glances. Even Jonathan's own lawyer seemed to shrink back, defeated. Jonathan remained motionless. He felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him as Grayson approached the clerk and requested Exhibit A. "The bank statements," Jonathan thought. "My trap is sprung," he observed as the large sheets of paper were unfurled and presented to the jury. Grayson pointed to highlighted figures, explaining with practiced ease how they proved Jonathan's guilt. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. "They think it's over," Jonathan thought, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "They have no idea what's coming." He rose to his feet, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the courtroom murmur. "Permission to approach the witness, Your Honor." Judge Calloway, momentarily startled by Jonathan's unexpected assertiveness, granted permission. Jonathan walked towards the witness stand, his every movement deliberate, controlled. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, a palpable pressure that seemed to crackle in the air. He stopped in front of Dorsey, their gazes locking in a silent battle of wills. Dorsey's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Mr. Dorsey," Jonathan began, his voice low but resonant, "these bank statements, they appear to be in order, don't they?" Dorsey swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Yes," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Jonathan held up a document, his own exhibit. "Then perhaps you can explain these discrepancies," he stated, his voice gaining strength. He pointed to a series of transactions, meticulously highlighted. They mirrored the transactions on the prosecution's exhibit, but with one crucial difference: the account numbers. "These transactions," Jonathan explained, his voice ringing with authority, "correspond to an offshore account registered in the name of Mark Singleton." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. All eyes turned to Mark Singleton, another of Dorsey's employees, sitting pale and trembling in the gallery. Dorsey's face was ashen. Jonathan pressed on, revealing a meticulously documented trail of evidence, each piece interlocking perfectly to expose the elaborate scheme orchestrated by Dorsey and Singleton. He detailed the coded messages, the shell corporations, the carefully timed transfers, all leading back to Dorsey, the mastermind behind the embezzlement. Grayson's confident demeanor had vanished. He stood frozen, his mouth agape, watching his case crumble before his eyes. Judge Calloway, initially amused by Jonathan's self-representation, now listened with rapt attention, his expression shifting from amusement to serious consideration, and finally, to dawning realization. Under Jonathan's relentless questioning, Singleton cracked. He confessed, his voice trembling, revealing Dorsey's involvement in the crime. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Dorsey sat slumped in the witness stand, his face a mask of defeat. Jonathan turned to Judge Calloway, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe the evidence speaks for itself." Judge Calloway, his gaze fixed on Dorsey, nodded slowly. "Indeed, Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice grave. "Indeed it does." The gavel fell, its sharp crack echoing through the silent courtroom, a final punctuation mark on Jonathan's victory. The weight that had been pressing down on him for months lifted, replaced by a profound sense of relief, and something else, a quiet satisfaction that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. The air in the courtroom crackled with a strange energy, a mix of anticipation and simmering tension. Jonathan Ellis, his suit crisp despite days of relentless pressure, stood facing Franklin Dorsey. Dorsey, usually so impeccably groomed, now seemed subtly disheveled, his tie knotted unevenly, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Jonathan could almost taste the fear emanating from him, a metallic tang in the otherwise stale courtroom air. He knows, Jonathan thought, he knows what's coming. "Mr. Dorsey," Jonathan's voice, though calm, carried a weight that commanded attention. He could feel the judge's gaze, no longer laced with amusement, but with a flicker of genuine interest. Finally, he thought, he's actually listening. How many employees did Wilson Harrington have in their financial division? Dorsey shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the sudden hush. "At the time of the incident, we had approximately 70 employees in the financial division." The words felt clipped, rehearsed. Jonathan could almost see the intricate web of lies Dorsey had constructed beginning to unravel. "And how many of them had clearance for financial transactions, Mr. Dorsey?" Jonathan pressed, his voice unwavering. He knew this was a crucial point. He had to dismantle the prosecution's narrative, brick by painstaking brick. Dorsey hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Jonathan wondered if it was fear or perhaps anger. He imagined the internal struggle raging within the man, the desperate attempt to maintain composure as the walls closed in. "It's too late," Jonathan thought, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. 62, Dorsey finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The number hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jonathan could practically feel the shift in the courtroom, the collective realization that the prosecution's carefully constructed case was starting to crumble. 62 employees, Jonathan repeated, letting the words sink in. He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly, making sure they understood the significance. 62 individuals who, according to Mr. Dorsey's own testimony, had access to the accounts in question. He paused, allowing the implication to hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Doubt," he thought. "That's all I need to sow." Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, shifted uneasily on his feet. Jonathan could sense his growing desperation. Grayson's initial smugness had been replaced by a thin film of sweat on his upper lip, a nervous twitch in his left eye. Jonathan felt a surge of something akin to pity, but he ruthlessly. The air in the courtroom hung thick with anticipation, a palpable tension clinging to the silence. Jonathan Ellis stood before the judge, a solitary figure amidst the imposing mahogany and polished brass. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of hushed whispers and the rustle of papers. He knew every eye in the room was on him, weighing, judging. He could feel the weight of their gazes, a physical pressure on his skin. "Don't falter now," he told himself, his inner voice a low hum of determination. "This is it." He glanced at the jury, their faces impassive masks, and then at Franklin Dorsey, his former boss, seated stiffly in the gallery. Dorsey's face, normally so animated, so full of bonhomie, was a carefully constructed blank slate. But Jonathan could see it, the flicker of something in his eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. Fear, or perhaps a desperate, cornered defiance. Judge Richard Calloway, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an air of amused skepticism, steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Mr. Ellis," he began, his voice laced with a hint of impatience, "are you quite ready to proceed?" Jonathan drew a slow, measured breath, adjusting the papers in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within. "Show them," a voice whispered in his head, a voice fueled by months of frustration, of sleepless nights spent poring over documents, searching for the thread that would unravel this web of lies. "Show them all. Then proceed, Mr. Ellis. The court is waiting." Calloway's tone implied that he didn't expect much. Jonathan could practically hear the unspoken thought. Another fool attempting to represent himself. "The prosecution," Jonathan began, his voice resonating with newfound confidence, "has presented a compelling narrative. A narrative, however, that is fundamentally flawed." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air. He could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle prickle of curiosity replacing the initial apathy. He met Grayson's gaze. The assistant district attorney's face was a mask of carefully controlled irritation, and a faint, bitter smile touched Jonathan's lips. "They have argued," he continued, "that on the 12th of June, I, Jonathan Ellis, initiated a series of unauthorized transactions, transferring company funds into a private account. They have presented bank statements, emails, and even testimony from Mr. Dorsey himself, all seemingly pointing to my guilt." He took another breath, savoring the growing tension in the room. The silence was almost electric. He could feel the weight of Dorsey's gaze burning into him, a tangible heat across the distance separating them. "He knows what's coming. However," Jonathan said, his voice rising slightly, injecting a note of steel into the quiet courtroom, "there is a piece of evidence they have overlooked, a crucial piece of evidence that dismantles their entire case." He turned to the bailiff. "Exhibit B, Your Honor." The bailiff, a stout man with a stoic expression, approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed folder. Judge Calloway opened it, his eyebrows rising slightly as he scanned the contents. He then looked up at Jonathan, a flicker of genuine interest now replacing the amusement. "Mr. Ellis," he said, "can you explain the significance of this document?" "Certainly, Your Honor," Jonathan replied, stepping forward. He could feel his heart pounding, a wild rhythm against his ribs, but his voice remained steady, unwavering. "This is it, the moment of truth." He pointed to the document, a printout of the company's internal security logs. "This, Your Honor, is a record of employee access to the building. It logs the time each employee swipes their badge to enter and exit." His gaze swept the jury, making eye contact with each of them in turn. He wanted them to understand, to truly grasp the implications of what he was about to reveal. He placed his finger on a specific entry in the log. "This," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, "is the time the first fraudulent transaction was made. 10:42 a.m. He moved his finger to another entry, just a few lines above. "And this, 10:39 a.m., the time I swiped my badge to leave the building. Security footage from the lobby will corroborate this." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway leaned forward, his expression now one of focused attention. Grayson, his face pale, stood rooted to the spot, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Jonathan continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "The prosecution's case rests on the assumption that I was at my computer, logged into the system, at the time of the transactions. This evidence proves unequivocally that I was not." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan could see the wheels turning in Judge Calloway's mind, the slow dawning of realization. He looked over at Dorsey, whose face had now lost all its carefully constructed composure. It was a mask of fear, stark and unmistakable. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice sharp, "do you have any explanation for this discrepancy?" Grayson stammered, his carefully crafted arguments crumbling around him. "Your Honor, I need to consult with my team." I think, Calloway interrupted, his voice laced with a hint of steel, that further consultation is unnecessary. He turned his gaze to Mark Singleton, a junior analyst who had worked closely with both Jonathan and Dorsey. Singleton had been a peripheral witness for the prosecution, his testimony bland and inconsequential. But now, Jonathan noticed his face was ashen, his hands trembling. He knows. He was in on it. Mr. Singleton, the judge's voice boomed across the silent courtroom. Perhaps you can enlighten us. Did you, by any chance, have access to Mr. Ellis's badge? Singleton's eyes darted nervously between Dorsey and the judge. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. Finally, his voice barely a whisper, he confessed. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Dorsey, he asked me. The truth, like a dam finally breaking, flooded the courtroom. Dorsey's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the fear and desperation beneath. The jury, once impassive, now buzzed with quiet murmurs. Judge Calloway, his face grim, banged his gavel. Mr. Dorsey, you are under arrest. The tension that had held the courtroom captive finally broke, replaced by a low hum of excited chatter. Jonathan stood there, a strange calmness settling over him as he watched the bailiffs lead Dorsey away. He had done it. He had faced the Goliath of the legal system, armed only with his own wit and determination, and he had won. The weight of the accusations, the months of sleepless nights, the fear it all seemed to lift from his shoulders, leaving him feeling strangely light, almost weightless. He had reclaimed his life, his reputation, his future, and in the echoing silence of the courtroom, he could finally hear it, clear and strong, the quiet whisper of victory. The air in the courtroom crackled with an almost palpable tension. Jonathan Ellis, standing alone at the defendant's table, felt the weight of every gaze upon him. His palms were damp, but his voice, when he spoke, was remarkably steady. The defense calls Mr. Mark Singleton to the stand. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Calloway, his initial amusement replaced by a frown of open curiosity, adjusted his spectacles. Jonathan met the judge's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Singleton, the key. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, a counterpoint to the measured rhythm of his own breathing. Across the room, Franklin Dorsey sat impassive, a granite statue in a tailored suit. Jonathan noted the subtle tightening of Dorsey's jaw, the almost imperceptible twitch in his left eyelid. He knows what's coming. Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, rose to his feet, an objection forming on his lips. But before he could utter a word, Judge Calloway silenced him with a raised hand. Mr. Singleton, the judge addressed the nervous man now being sworn in. You may proceed. Mark Singleton shifted uneasily in the witness box, his eyes darting between Jonathan, the judge, and the jury. He fidgeted with his tie, the knot loosening under his trembling fingers. Jonathan watched him, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He's terrified. Good. He needed Singleton's fear to work in his favor. Mr. Singleton, Jonathan began, his voice calm and measured, each word carefully chosen. Were you aware of the changes made to my system access credentials on the evening of July 12th? Singleton's eyes flickered towards Dorsey, then back to Jonathan. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I was aware of some changes, yes. His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the hushed silence of the courtroom. Jonathan pressed on, his gaze unwavering. He knew he couldn't afford a single misstep. Were you, in fact, the one who implemented these changes, Mr. Singleton? Inside, a tense coil of anticipation tightened. This is it. Singleton's silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The courtroom held its breath. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. Jonathan could almost taste the man's fear, thick and cloying in the air. He sensed Grayson's rising panic, the DA's carefully constructed case crumbling before his eyes. He thought he had me. A flicker of something cold, almost akin to satisfaction, ran through Jonathan. Singleton stammered, his voice cracking. I was just following orders. The words tumbled out, barely audible. He glanced desperately at Dorsey, a silent plea for help. Dorsey remained motionless, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, almost intimate murmur that nonetheless carried throughout the hushed courtroom. Whose orders, Mr. Singleton? Singleton's shoulders slumped. He seemed to shrink in the witness box, his body folding in on itself. The air in the room felt thick, charged with unspoken truths. The rhythmic ticking of the courtroom clock seemed to amplify the silence. Dorsey, he finally choked out, the name hanging in the air like a poisoned dart. Franklin Dorsey told me to do it. The courtroom erupted. A cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and the frantic scribbling of reporters filled the air. Judge Calloway banged his gavel, struggling to restore order. Jonathan, however, remained outwardly impassive, his expression betraying none of the turbulent emotions raging within him. Checkmate. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as though he were observing the scene from a distance. He had anticipated this moment, planned for it, and yet, now that it was here, it felt surreal. Grayson, his face ashen, looked as though he'd been struck a physical blow. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Dorsey, finally, turned his head, his eyes meeting Jonathan's across the courtroom. In that brief, charged moment, Jonathan saw not anger, but a cold, calculating appraisal. He's still playing the game. The realization sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. Judge Calloway addressed Singleton, his voice stern. Mr. Singleton, you understand the gravity of this accusation? You're implicating Mr. Dorsey in a serious felony. Singleton, now weeping openly, nodded miserably. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't know what it was for at first. He just told me to reset Mr. Ellis's credentials. Said it was a security issue. I didn't know he was going to use it till his voice trailed off, choked with sobs. Jonathan watched the scene unfold, his mind racing. He's lying. Singleton's story didn't quite add up. There was more to it, something he wasn't revealing. Jonathan had a hunch that Dorsey's scheme went deeper than simple embezzlement. Mr. Dorsey, Judge Calloway addressed the man who remained stubbornly silent. Do you have any comment on these allegations? Dorsey's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. He shook his head slowly, his silence speaking volumes. The judge turned back to Singleton. You claim Mr. Dorsey instructed you to reset Mr. Ellis's credentials. Do you have any evidence to support this claim? Emails? Messages? Anything? Singleton hesitated, his eyes darting nervously towards Dorsey again. I deleted them. Dorsey told me to. A wave of weariness washed over Jonathan. Of course he did. He'd expected as much. Dorsey was meticulous, thorough. He'd covered his tracks well. But Jonathan still had one last card to play. He addressed the judge, his voice regaining its steel-edged precision. Your Honor, I request permission to submit a new piece of evidence. He held up a small USB drive. This contains recovered security footage from the server room, time-stamped the night of July 12th. It clearly shows Mr. Singleton entering the server room at 11:47 p.m., accessing my account, and resetting my credentials. The courtroom buzzed again. Grayson looked defeated, his shoulders slumped. The jury, once skeptical, now stared at Dorsey with open suspicion. Judge Calloway, his eyes narrowed, took the USB drive. He inserted it into his laptop and watched the footage in silence. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Jonathan watched the judge's expression, searching for a clue, any hint of what he was thinking. It all comes down to this. Finally, Judge Calloway looked up, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. He addressed the jury, his voice grave. Members of a jury, based on the evidence presented and the testimony of Mr. Singleton, I believe there is sufficient cause to dismiss the charges against Mr. Ellis. He paused, his gaze settling on Dorsey. Furthermore, I instruct the bailiff to detain Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Singleton pending further investigation into these new allegations. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. As the bailiff moved to apprehend Dorsey and Singleton, Jonathan felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The fight was far from over, but for now, he had won this battle. He had cleared his name. The air in the courtroom crackled, thick with anticipation. Jonathan Ellis stood before the bench, a solitary figure amidst the hushed whispers and the weight of expectant gazes. His outward composure, a meticulously crafted shield, barely concealed the maelstrom of emotions churning within him. Doubt, a persistent shadow that had haunted him for months, still flickered at the edges of his mind. But beneath it, a bedrock of resolve held firm, fueled by the burning ember of injustice. He had come too far to falter now. He met Judge Calloway's gaze, the older man's initial amusement now replaced by a flicker of something akin to respect, perhaps even awe. Jonathan took a slow, deliberate breath, the courtroom's silence amplifying the sound. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade, "I have presented evidence demonstrating the manipulation of financial records and the fabrication of transactions designed to incriminate me." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. He saw Dorsey, his former boss, sitting rigid in the gallery, a mask of forced indifference clinging precariously to his face. The subtle tightening of Dorsey's jaw, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands, these were the silent confessions Jonathan had been waiting for. "These transactions," Jonathan continued, his finger tracing the lines of a meticulously prepared document, "can be directly linked to offshore accounts controlled by Mr. Dorsey and facilitated by Mr. Singleton." He could feel Grayson, the assistant DA, stiffen beside him. Grayson's initial smug confidence had eroded, replaced by a desperate, almost frantic energy. He shuffled papers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, a physical manifestation of his unraveling case. Jonathan allowed himself a small, inward sigh of relief. He was close, so close. He presented further bank statements, meticulously highlighting discrepancies, each one a nail in the coffin of the prosecution's case. With each piece of evidence, Jonathan felt a sliver of the immense pressure lift, replaced by a growing sense of vindication. He could practically taste it, the bittersweet tang of freedom. The judge leaned forward, his gaze sharp and focused, no longer the detached observer, but an active participant in this unfolding drama. He scrutinized the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the courtroom stretched, taut as a wire. Jonathan watched, his heart a drum against his ribs. This was it. Everything rested on this moment. The judge looked up, his eyes meeting Jonathan's. In that gaze, Jonathan saw not just acknowledgement, but a dawning understanding. "Mr. Grayson," the judge addressed the prosecutor, his voice resonating with authority. "Do you have any further evidence to present?" Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked from the judge to the documents spread before him, a flicker of defeat darkening his eyes. He knew. They all knew. "No, Your Honor," Grayson finally conceded, the words heavy with resignation. Jonathan felt a surge of triumph course through him, but he tamped it down, maintaining his outward calm. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. He knew this fight wasn't just about his own freedom. It was about exposing a deeper corruption, a rot that had festered within the very system he had trusted. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice resonating with quiet power, "I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against me." The judge nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "The motion is granted," he declared, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The tension that had permeated the room for days, for months, finally snapped, replaced by a collective exhale. Jonathan felt the last vestiges of doubt dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of relief. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze now fixed on Dorsey, who sat frozen, his face ashen. "Given the evidence presented by Mr. Ellis, I'm also ordering an immediate investigation into Franklin Dorsey and Mark Singleton." Singleton, Dorsey's accomplice, shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The net was closing in. He cracked. It was Dorsey. He forced me. I didn't want to. Singleton's panic confession spilled into the courtroom, a torrent of fear and desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at Dorsey, his voice cracking. Dorsey remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The mask of indifference finally shattered, revealing the stark reality of his guilt. Jonathan watched the scene unfold, a strange sense of detachment washing over him. The fight was over. He had won. As the bailiff approached Dorsey and Singleton, Jonathan turned and walked towards the courtroom doors, each step echoing the rhythm of his regained freedom. The sunlight that streamed through the open doors seemed to embrace him, washing away the shadows of the past months. He stepped out into the blinding light, leaving behind the hushed whispers and the lingering scent of despair that clung to the courtroom. The final lines of the court transcript, stark and impersonal, documented the dismissal of the charges against Jonathan Ellis. But they couldn't capture the true weight of that moment, the profound sense of liberation, the quiet triumph of perseverance against overwhelming odds. They couldn't capture the complex tapestry of emotions that had woven themselves through the fabric of Jonathan's ordeal. They couldn't capture the silent understanding that passed between Jonathan and the judge, an acknowledgement of the inherent flaws in the system, and the courage it takes to challenge them. The transcript remained a cold, factual record of events. But for Jonathan, the memory of that moment, the feeling of freedom, the knowledge that justice, however delayed, had finally prevailed, would remain etched in his heart, a testament to the enduring power of truth.